On multiple occasions, Martin Scorsese has given his feelings on the current state of modern franchises and comic book films, and it's been met with quite mixed responses. Of course, you're always going to get frustration in the online world, as for a majority of the outlets and the online spaces, movie news is comic book and franchise driven. But in a new interview with GQ, Scorsese tapped into the very notion of what he was originally aiming to address, but this time with a bit more detail. And that is the very idea of modern franchise culture, how he believes it has affected the way audiences perceive what cinema is, and why he thinks directors like Christopher Nolan and beyond him should be the ones getting more support. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing Scorsese's recent comments on the state of modern franchises and giving my own thoughts towards it. Before I get into it though, if you want to keep up to date on any of my content surrounding auteur filmmakers like Martin Scorsese and his upcoming film Killers of the Flower Moon, then don't forget to support this upload by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. But without further ado, let's dive into the new interview with Martin Scorsese. So in the interview with the director for GQ, he talked about many things beyond the topic of this video. He talked about the ambition with his new film Killers of the Flower Moon, his current feelings towards making cinema, his career, and the years it took him to understand the medium. But what appears in the online headlines once again is his comments towards modern comic book movies and franchises. The first time he talked about them, I didn't want to go into it because just personally, I agreed with and understood what he was getting at. But since all the debates online and now leading up to his latest comments, I think it provides much more than just the idea that comic book movies are not cinema. And that's because Scorsese goes into more detail about why he feels the way he does and why that's more concerned with the effects of modern franchise culture from those mentioned types of content. So let's first get into what he said in the interview. GQ asked him, "What do you think changed with the industry that a filmmaker as talented and dedicated as you just can't make the films that they want?" He said, "Well, the industry is over. In other words, the industry that I was part of, we're talking almost 50 years ago, it's like saying to somebody in 1970 who made silent films, what do you think's happened? Studios," he said, "are not interested any longer in supporting individual voices that express their personal feelings or their personal thoughts and personal ideas and feelings on a big budget. And what's happened now is that they've pigeonholed it to what they call indies." The article mentions that Scorsese is often seen as a defender of how things used to be, in part because of his work with the Film Foundation, which preserves and restores hundreds of films. He continued saying, "I think there will always be theatrical because people want to experience this thing together. But at the same time, the theatres have to step up to make them places where people will want to go and enjoy themselves or want to go and see something that moves them." GQ then mentions to Scorsese that the movie theatres could show only the films that Hollywood actually made, and there might lie the problem. That if Hollywood makes mostly comic book and franchise movies and certain segments of the audience don't want to see those films, then nothing is going to get them to a movie theatre. The interviewer then asks him, "What is it doing to our culture?" And Scorsese replies, "Because there are going to be generations now that think movies are only those, that's what movies are. They already think that, which means that we have to then fight back stronger, and it's got to come from the grassroots level. It's got to come from the filmmakers themselves, and you'll have, the Safdie brothers and you'll have Christopher Nolan. Hit 'em from all sides and don't give up. Let's see see what you got, go out there and do it, don't complain about it. But it's true because we've got to save cinema. Cinema could be anything, it didn't just have to be serious. But I do think that the manufactured content isn't really cinema. I don't want to say it, but what I mean is that it's manufactured content. It's almost like AI making a film, and that doesn't mean that you don't have incredible directors and special effects people doing beautiful artwork. But what does it mean? What will it give you, aside from a kind of consumption of something and then eliminating it from your mind and your whole body? So what is it giving you? So this is why I mostly agree with Scorsese, and especially what he said in this new interview. He specifically talks about the effects that the studio and manufactured approach to cinema has had on culture and people's idea of what cinema is. Having studied film itself, cinema is an art form and a point of artistic expression. Yes, you want to make successful movies so that you can continue making them, but with an artistic form like this, there has to be a collaboration between the artists, the art they put to screen, and how the studios drive that to some form of success. Now, of course, not all comic book movies are being addressed with this Scorsese critique. Online yesterday, people were saying, how can Scorsese critique comic book culture but praise Christopher Nolan, who has directed a comic book trilogy? Well, he's not talking about comic book movies as a whole, he's talking about the content-driven approach to some of them and the distinction between how some are made in a more manufactured way over the examples that lean more into the creativity on the part of the filmmaker and their collaborators. When Nolan made the Dark Knight trilogy, he had to convince the studio that it was a good idea to reboot a popular character as an artistic film, more than one focused on just selling and being a part of popular conventions. He had control over who he worked with, working with them on writing in pre-production, filming in main production, and editing in post-production to build his overall artistic vision. Yes, the film has that blockbuster element to it and one that attracts a diverse range of audiences, but at the very basic level of things, it was driven by a filmmaker who had his artistic vision. We can say the same thing about some comic book films today, whether it's Joker, Logan, The Batman, or even some MCU projects like James Gunn's Guardians of the Galaxy, for instance, where a creative voice has more freedom to make their adaptation of comic book characters, and they have input throughout the stages of the work. And those examples are beyond just solid comic book storytelling, because they also use the visual and sonic properties of the medium to their advantage as well. They create a world on screen and narratively that adds to the medium and can only be elevated by that theatrical medium, which is exactly what cinema is supposed to do. They don't feel like manufactured studio endeavors where the brand is the sole selling point and the filmmaking is typically done with standard, easier processes, whether it be green screen focused, ridiculous amounts of money pumped into visual effects, and writing standards that are repeating themselves project to project. Yes, some of these things are tools that can be used well and have been from time to time, but in a lot of cases, especially right now, they are being rushed to prioritize content and in a way that also makes it mentally stressful for workers to do their job well. Think about the VFX artists and their stories over recent years. So with what Scorsese and other filmmakers are pushing for, it's a return to that creative filmmaking mindset. There's essentially a fairer collaboration between artists and the studio to make something that speaks to the cinematic medium and gives the audience something more than just familiar content and approaches. And again, as I started off with, cinema is an art form. To me, comic book movies are cinema, there's just examples of them right now that just aren't adding to the medium in ways that connect to cinema's sole idea of being an expressive art form. And that stems from the way artists are either being treated or from the way studios are focusing too much on the monetary sides of their products. And it is starting to backfire a bit. There needs to be a balance, and that's what Scorsese means when he mentions Christopher Nolan as an example. Someone who this this year has took a film called Oppenheimer, made $900 million, and done so by giving us a cinematic event that is his artistic expression, and one that we can only watch in its full glory on the big screen. We currently aren't getting that enough with the big franchises or comic book films that have way bigger budgets and audience appeal. With much smaller movies, there is of course much more room for expression, but with the comic book landscape dominating the culture of cinema, doing so with films that feel manufactured or have similarities in the way they are filmed to fit that brand, it makes it hard for the average audience member to see beyond what's being given to them. There was a time where blockbusters were starting off, and it included audiences embracing original work or science fiction stuff that hadn't been seen before or shown on a big screen in the ways they were. It wasn't just original stories, because the filmmaking was groundbreaking too. They felt like films that were made for the theatrical experience. It wasn't content that you could just watch at home on streaming, and the large form presentation of films was used with more creativity and care. To make it clear, I'm someone who supports all types of cinema. I want to see good comic book films from Marvel and DC, ones that have just as much artistic influence as they do in content, branding and profits. And I want to see good original films that are embraced and given a chance by the audience too. This year we have had quite a great one for that, but it's come with directors like Nolan, for instance, who do have a long track record of succeeding with original stuff. And then of course Barbie is based on a well-recognized toy all around the world. But take The Creator for example, a sci-fi film coming out this week which has had glowing reviews about its artistic approach, and as a whole is being labelled as a film that is really stunning on a cinematic scale. Now I hope it's successful, but I do have my concerns because of its marketing push, and I guess we'll have to see if film viewers do go out and embrace it. That being said, I think culture will continuously change. I think popular franchises today can regather the artistic quality that they used to have on a more frequent basis. I think popular IP and original work can both do well together, and with films like Oppenheimer, Barbie, Dune and so on, there's definitely this refound sense of consistent growth amongst the more artistic director-driven approaches. And with this happening, all I can say is that I hope that audiences today will give more movies like this from other filmmakers a chance. I think Scorsese is right about this, and I think filmmaking should be approached more from a collaborative system between the studio and the filmmakers. Cinema is an art form that should be evolved and also preserved, and the worry from Scorsese is how some franchises and comic book approaches are being treated more as a streaming service where the amount of content is prioritized over the art form that cinema is. And in turn, that affects the perception of movie culture. To me, this interview got his point across so much better because originally it led to those misinterpreting his words and fueling this big war on what is a real movie and what isn't. Instead, he was actually talking about the effects that manufactured approaches have on film culture as a whole, especially when that has been the big studio's main focus. But that was my video discussing the recent comments of Martin Scorsese. I couldn't agree more with him when it comes to the changing perception of cinema because of the studio's focus on content over the art form. As I say, I think both need to work in tandem, and it becomes hard to save the art of cinema when a lot of the popularity of the medium is primarily focused on the monetization of loads of content. It's the way cinema's content is being treated like that of streaming which worries me the most, and part of Scorsese's interview really taps into the alarming nature of it. Hopefully, the recent success of director-driven films like Oppenheimer, Barbie, and so on means that there is a future where, on a larger scale, we can see cinematic events on the big screen that combine true art with successful filmmaker-driven content. And I guess we can only wait and see if more films outside of the current franchise norm can bridge that appeal further. But what do you think towards the comments from the filmmaker, and do you think he has a point when he talks about the effects of recent franchise fare on cinematic culture? Let me know down below in the comment section. For much more videos and updates on Martin Scorsese and his upcoming film Killers of the Flower Moon, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like, rating, and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.